and welcome back to Exposed, Scandalous Vials of the Elite. I am your host, Jim Chapman, and we're back with this part 6 and the final episode of the Micah Miller case as part of our Exposed Investigates series. And the last time that I left you, J.P. Miller had filed a conglomerate of lawsuits against other people he claimed were slandering him. And then a lawsuit is filed that would shake this entire case up, as JP himself was accused in the rape of a 15-year-old girl. So let's get into it. And I have the actual lawsuit in front of me. I'm going to cover that now for you. And it is a Jane Doe number 1 versus John Paul Miller, Reginald Wayne Miller, All Nations Cathedral Church, Cathedral Baptist Church, and Solid Rock Ministries. And we're going to get into the factual allegations. And it says, by 2023, J.P. Miller had positioned himself as a high-ranking pastor of a large congregation, presenting himself as a spiritual leader while continuing to engage in predatory behavior. In 2023, the plaintiff encountered John Paul Miller in person in Myrtle Beach while accompanied by a friend. Despite being in a public setting, John Paul Miller leaned into Jane Doe, number 1, as if to hug her and shoved his hand down her pants, touching her genitals without consent. The plaintiff immediately recoiled and tried to brush it off and move his hand because she didn't think her friend noticed, and she was scared. About 30 minutes later, Jane Doe number 1 and John Paul Miller had a heated argument about him using his title of pastor and use of scripture to justify that sexual misconduct. In response, John Paul Miller cited scripture, telling the plaintiff, quote, "No man is without sin and temptation. God understands that." The plaintiff was left reeling from this encounter, experiencing a long-delayed spiral of self-doubt and depression caused by this fresh assault on her by John Paul Miller. This sexual assault by John Paul Miller triggered repressed memories of the plaintiff of things which occurred at an earlier time. Upon later reflection and trying to remember previous events, the plaintiff realized that John Paul Miller had assaulted her almost 20 years before. Jane Doe number 1 was sexually assaulted at the age of 15 in 1998 by John Paul Miller. At the time, she did not fully comprehend the nature of what had happened to her or the extent of the harm it caused. The trauma was deeply buried, and for decades she had no conscious recollection of the assault. The plaintiff lost her memory before she turned 18, likely within a few months or a year of the occurrence of the 1998 assault. It was not until she experienced another sexual assault in 2023 by John Paul Miller that the suppressed memories of the 1998 incident resurfaced. Through therapy and reflection following the more recent assault, Jane Doe came to understand the profound impact of the earlier abuse, as well as its connection to the psychological and emotional struggle she had endured throughout her life. After her memories were triggered by the second assault, the plaintiff remembered details of the 1998 sexual assault. In June of 1998, plaintiff Jane Doe number 1, then a 15-year-old minor, attended All Nations Church, formerly known as the Cathedral Baptist Church of Grand Strand, Inc. The plaintiff spent her summers in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, residing with her grandparents, who were members of Cathedral. The plaintiff's time in Myrtle Beach was supposed to be a period of safety, love, and warmth. Her grandparents were her support system, and the summers she spent with them were among the happiest times of her childhood. John Paul Miller was a 19-year-old adult male employed at Cathedral as a youth leader and musician at Cathedral in 1998. At the time of the events in question, John Paul Miller was known to his father, the head pastor, and other members as a troubled individual with a history of reckless behavior, including prior legal trouble, a child born out of wedlock, and a pattern of misconduct. Church leadership, including defendant Reginald Wayne Miller, who was John Paul Miller's father and the head pastor, failed to take reasonable steps to monitor John Paul Miller's behavior and continued to allow him unrestricted access to minor children at the church, in the sanctuary, his father's office, or in the church programs, including the youth program. Reginald Wayne Miller had personally engaged in sexual misconduct himself before 1998. He knew his son was engaging in sexual misconduct. This was the proverbial fox guarding the henhouse. Reginald Wayne Miller did not institute any type of safeguard over the damages posed by John Paul Miller or himself. Reginald Wayne Miller had complete control of the church by virtue of the bylaws, which left him in complete control of the church without oversight by anyone else. Though he was in control, there were other leaders of the church who could have intervened to protect minors at the church. They did not. They ceded complete control to Reginald Wayne Miller, who allowed his son, John Paul, to have free reign over the church and the minors of the church. This church was John Paul Miller's sexual playground. Leadership at the church, including Reginald Wayne Miller, should have undertaken something to protect the minors of the church from John Paul or any other predator. They did not. On or about July 19th of 1998, a Sunday morning, the plaintiff attended cathedral with her grandparents and her grandmother, who proceeded to her Sunday school class held in a separate classroom building, this academy building on church property. The plaintiff initially intended to attend Sunday school with her grandmother, but changed her mind and instead went to the church building, where she intended on going to her grandfather's Sunday school class. The classes had begun and the doors were shut, and Jane Doe number 1 wasn't aware which room he was in, so instead of interrupting classes, she entered the main church sanctuary. John Paul Miller was playing the piano and another band member was strumming a guitar. Upon noticing the plaintiff, John Paul Miller engaged her in conversation. At some point, the plaintiff stepped away from the sanctuary and walked down the hall to the restroom. When plaintiff exited the restroom, she encountered John Paul Miller standing near his father's office door. John Paul called out the plaintiff's name and initiated a seemingly innocent conversation inquiring about a mutual friend's recent absence from the church. Without warning, John Paul forced plaintiff inside his father's office, shutting the door behind them. John Paul immediately became aggressive, physically overpowering the plaintiff and forcing her against her will. Despite the plaintiff's struggles and verbal pleas for him to stop, John Paul ignored her and forcefully moved her out of the office, down the hallway into a door that led outside to a grassy side yard of the church where John Paul's truck was parked. John Paul then forced Jane Doe number 1 into his truck, and this is where he raped her. At the time of the assault, the plaintiff was a virgin. The plaintiff was terrified, physically overpowered, and left defenseless against John Paul's assault. John Paul, an adult man in a position of authority within the church, took full advantage of the plaintiff's youth, inexperience, and vulnerability to commit this heinous act. Following the sexual assault, the plaintiff remained silent about what had occurred with John Paul Miller and was overcome by shock, shame, and fear. In the following months, the plaintiff exhibited clear signs of trauma, including severe depression, social withdrawal from family and friends, declining academic performance, and emotional distress and self-doubt. Despite prior concerns about John Paul's behavior, church leadership, including Reginald Wayne Miller, failed to take any action to investigate or prevent further abuse. Shortly after being assaulted by John Paul in 2023, the plaintiff received a text message informing her that John Paul Miller's wife had died. The cause of death reported was a gunshot wound to the head under suspicious circumstances. Within hours of her death, John Paul delivered a sermon using manipulative rhetoric to maintain control over the congregation, despite the tragic and questionable circumstances surrounding his wife's passing. This was yet another example of John Paul's conniving and manipulative behavior. Plaintiff suffered immense guilt after John Paul Miller's wife's death, believing that had she spoken sooner, she may have prevented further harm to others. This guilt and shame experienced by Jane Doe number 1 for not reporting the second assault at the time of occurrence or the first assault after her memories came flooding back was another insult to the plaintiff's emotional psyche. John Paul Miller's history of predatory behavior, his continued acts of harassment and assault, and the defendant's failure to protect children and to prevent John Paul's unfettered access to minor children have caused the plaintiff severe and lasting harm. So there are the facts as this Jane Doe number 1 alleges them. And JP answers that lawsuit, and of course he denies everything and files a lawsuit of his own, accusing the accuser of slander. So it's important to keep in mind this is a civil lawsuit, not a criminal charge. So he's not looking at jail time on this, but should this be proven in civil court, it will definitely hit him in the wallet. So JP's legal obligations do not end there. With cases coming out against him, he is being accused of things such as witness intimidation and bribery. Fit News released an article in late February of this year I'm going to cover for you. And the headline says, John Paul Miller accused of attempted bribery, witness intimidation, and other allegations linked to a September 2024 lawsuit filed by a paralegal. And it says, the defendant in a defamation case filed last fall by scandal-scarred South Carolina pastor John Paul Miller has accused him of bribery and witness tampering related to a barrage of lawsuits filed earlier this year in Myrtle Beach. Paralegal Melissa Mancari said the notorious Solid Rock pastor, whose wife Micah Miller died under suspicious circumstances last spring, offered to compensate her to, quote, lie under oath in connection with these lawsuits. The development is the latest bizarre narrative twist to follow Micah's supposed suicide on April 27, 2024, an event which propelled this saga into the international stage. Mancari's allegations were provided in the form of a letter to the county clerk of court, Renee Elvis, complete with receipts, which included screenshots of communications between her and the embattled pastor. Last week, Myrtle Beach magistrate Chris Ericus provided this information to 14 defendants with pending civil cases filed against them by Miller. According to Mancari, Miller offered to drop the lawsuit against her and to compensate her for testifying on his behalf in court hearings against protesters who are defendants in civil cases filed by Miller. On September 17, 2024, Miller filed a defamation case against Mancari seeking $6 million in damages. The paralegal was never served the summons and complaint in the case. However, between January 10th, 2025 and January 31st, 2025, Miller and 3 of his associates filed a total of 34 civil suits in Myrtle Beach Magistrate Court against an array of protesters, content creators, and others who Miller accused of intruding on his life and causing financial losses, which he estimated at $7,500 per defendant, the maximum amount recoverable in magistrate court. Miller filed additional motions requesting restraining orders against numerous individuals. Since restraining order requests are not recorded in the public index unless attached to the civil complaint, the total number of requests and identities of all those singled out by Miller remains unknown. Of the 34 civil suits filed by Miller and his associates in January as of this publication, which this was February 24th of 2025, 14 have been dismissed while 4 have filed counterclaims. 14 defendants remain on the receiving end of pending cases. On February 14th of 2025, Mancari filed a motion to dismiss Miller's case against her. Quote, the plaintiff failed to obtain the service of process on the defendant within 120 days of filing the complaint. This is required by South Carolina Rules of Civil Procedure, the filing stated. Furthermore, the plaintiff still has not obtained the service of process on the defendant, now 149 days after filing the complaint. Miller's former attorney, Russell Long, filed a stipulation of dismissal, essentially dismissing the case against Mancari. Hours later, Mancari reported John Paul Miller to the Myrtle Beach Police Department. According to emails provided to the court, Mancari described an incident which allegedly took place on the evening of February 6 of 2025. According to her documentation, she received a text message from Miller asking her to give false testimony on the upcoming trial. Mancari also reported that Miller reiterated this request in an email to her place of employment on February 7th of 2025. According to Mancari, Miller allegedly asked her to state that protesters, quote, attack cars, harass him, take pictures of license plates, post the license plates online, abuse him, and even stalk him at every location he visits. In her letter to Elvis, Mancari said, quote, none of that matched what I witnessed at the legally organized protest. He is using a lawsuit that I was never served as a weapon against me to obtain what he wants out of me. Receipts provided by Mancari also revealed information about Miller's alleged attempts to evade monitoring of his phone tied to an ongoing probe led by the FBI. A third party involved in a group chat about the details said they used an app called Signal to talk on the phone. Quote, they took 3 phones away from him already, the other party said. They can probably hear what we say if they have an active tap. But if not, they get nothing because my number won't show up as calling him. Of the 7 hearings scheduled this week, 3 of the defendants are protesters who are facing multiple civil suits. Melissa Pfeiffer, Alexandria Cuazzo, and Sandra Karen. These defendants are being represented by Philip Corey. All 3 have filed counterclaims against Miller, requesting a change of venue because their claims against him exceed the $7,500 limit on recoverable damages. Karen's counterclaim referenced a June 30th, 2024 incident in which protesters were sprayed with water from a church sprinkler system while peacefully exercising their First Amendment rights. It also highlighted a November 6, 2024 parking lot altercation which led to Miller's arrest for assault. Quote, since the start of these protests in May of 2024 to present, the plaintiff has engaged in a pattern of conduct to harass and intimidate defendant as a means of silencing her voice and suppressing her right to free speech under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Miller has used his position at his church and the church's resources to direct congregants and other agents of the church to harass, intimidate, and silence Karen. It remains to be seen whether Mancari's claims will impact the pending litigation or result in criminal charges for the notorious pastor as this legal battle unfolds. And there it ends. So at this point, I've brought you completely up to date with this case. And I'm going to give you my thoughts on this investigation after reviewing thousands of documents. And it's important to note just my opinion here. First, do I think that J.P. Miller personally killed Micah Miller? And my answer is no, I don't. I honestly can tell you, in my opinion, J.P. Miller ain't that smart, folks. No way he could have pulled that off without leaving any evidence or being seen somewhere or going or coming from the scene. I just think he's too stupid, in my opinion, to cover his tracks that well. Second, I don't think he hired anyone to kill Micah. And to sum that up, I agree with the findings of those who investigated this case extensively and concluded that Micah did indeed commit suicide. Now, while I don't think JP may have hired anybody to do it or did it himself, that doesn't mean, personally, in my opinion, I don't believe he was culpable in her death. Look, there's a lot of states now in which a law exists and specifically related to high school bullying. And sadly, there are a lot of people that you never hear about that commit suicide, these high school kids, because they're being bullied to death by other high school kids. And in some cases, there have been situations where someone was encouraging One student encouraging another student, why don't you just kill yourself? That kind of stuff. To the point that these people actually kill themselves. And there's some states out there that make that culpability, that encouragement of suicide, criminally liable in the death of someone. So do I think J.P. Miller played a huge role in Micah Miller's suicide? My opinion? You better believe it. I think this piece of shit mind fucked her to the point that she killed herself. This is my opinion. And I think he needs to be held accountable for that criminally. Not civilly, criminally. So if you're listening to this and you're in South Carolina and you don't have that law I just spoke of regarding culpability, lobby your legislator. Ask them why they don't have that law. Because I do believe he's culpable criminally. And look, I don't know. I wasn't there. Nobody outside of Micah Miller, and if someone else was involved, that person, no, with 100% fact. None of us can know that. But judging from all the evidence, I just don't think this sucker was smart enough to pull that off. It seems like everything this idiot did, people found out about. I don't think he could pull that off. I don't think he could pull off hiring someone to do it. I just don't believe that. Looking at the evidence doesn't mean it's not true. I just don't see it. I agree with the investigators here. But again, has nothing to do with the fact that I believe that sumbitch is culpable and I believe he needs to stand trial for it. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I will, of course, keep you updated on J.P. Miller periodically as things come out. And with this lawsuit that I just read you, I mean, I'll definitely keep you updated on that. But we're going to go ahead now and I'm going to conclude this first subject in the Exposed Investigates series. And before I get out of here today, I do have a global celebrity, our newest member, to shout out, Miss L. Claudette Moore, who is from Calhoun, Georgia. And y'all, Calhoun lies in the valley that was the heart of the Cherokee Nation and the site of the infamous Trail of Tears. So welcome to the celebrity Patreon members, Miss Moore. Glad to have you. And if you would like to check out the Patreon, please do so. Patreon.com/exposed podcast files. We do everything from commercial-free early releases to files you can't get anywhere else, covering everything that we talk about on this show. You can also get quarterly merch as part of our celebrity members. Shout out. Check us out on the Patreon. And we have wrapped up 2 series this past week. We wrapped up Murdaugh and we wrapped up Micah Miller. So we got some new stuff headed your way starting next week that I think you're going to like. Thank you so much for your support. Please, if you have not done so, give us a rating on whatever app you listen to. There should be a way to rate us. It really helps other people find the show. Thank you so much. And until next time, for Exposed, Scandalous Files of the Elite, I'm your host, Jim Chapman. Much love.